When Louis Kahn died in 1974, he left behind the legacy of one of the most influential architects of the second half of the 20th century. His work includes the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, the Phillips Exeter Academy's library, and the Capitol buildings in Bangladesh. But Kahn also left behind a secret life story. He had 3 families, one with his wife and the other 2 with his lovers. One of his children is Nathaniel Kahn, who was 11 at the time of his father's death. His new documentary film, My Architect, A Son's Journey, is a story about Louis Kahn, the architect and the man, and here is a look.
For years, I struggled to be satisfied with the little piece of my father's life I'd been allowed to see. But it wasn't enough. I needed to know him. I needed to find out who he really was. So I set out on a journey to see his buildings and to find whatever was left of him out there. It would take me to the other side of the world, looking for the man who left me with so many questions.
I am pleased to have Nathaniel Kahn at this table. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure. I guess the question is, where did this begin for you in terms of, it began for you because here you wanted to know, this curiosity.
Sure.
But the idea of taking curiosity to a film is a huge step.
Sure. Well, as a filmmaker, you always look for a good story, and this story was something that's been rattling around in my head since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And my father left me with tremendous mysteries. He died when I was 11 and didn't live with us. So I've always wondered, really, who was this man? I certainly had, a peek at him, but I didn't see that much of him. So when I became a filmmaker, this has always been something I thought, am I ready to do this yet? And I kept saying no.
So it was
not
there
ready,
even before you weren't ready, even though you knew you weren't ready.
Absolutely. It's a film I've wanted to make for a long time. Yeah.
And did the making of the film satisfy you?
Well, you set out to find certain things, and there are certain questions I had at the beginning of this film. And then you find other things. There are more mysteries that open up, mysteries upon mysteries. So there's certainly some questions that I had about him that got answered, but other questions opened up. And I think the sort of fundamental question of who a person really is, more there at the end of the story than it is at the beginning.
In other words, the more you knew, the more questions you had.
Sure, absolutely.
The broader in a sense, the imponderable is.
Yeah, well, there's that sort of eternal mystery that between parents and children. Who really is your parent? And in my case, who really was my father? What was he really like? What was he made of? What made him tick? And those are things that I think, the deeper I got into it, the more, I understood certain parts of it, but then other parts just became more mysterious to me.
And so you went in search, and so, there's this wonderful scene where you're walking up to meet Philip Johnson, the great Philip Johnson who lives in New Canaan, and you're there at this, he's Van der Rohe inspired
pavilion,
house,
beautiful house,
pavilion and everything else. And then you go and you're talking to Vince Scully, who used to be professor of architecture at Yale. I guess still maybe professor emeritus or something.
He is
there.
A wonderful teacher.
Bob Stern. Always always asking.
Tell me about
my father.
Yes,
it's that simple.
Yeah,
that's simple. Pursuit of that question.
In some ways, it's almost embarrassing.
Yeah.
Here comes a nearly middle-aged man asking the question a child asks.
Right.
Tell me about my father. And yet somehow, what was so surprising in making this film was how much those people had to say to me. Each one of them. And it wasn't just the big architects. We have, as you know, we have taxi drivers in this film, and we have the women in my father's life. And we have people he met in far-flung places, in India and Bangladesh and Israel. And all of them, on some level, I'm asking the same question, tell me about my father. So.
Before I talk about the personal story, tell me, define his greatness for me.
Well, that's a hard thing. I'm not an architectural historian, but I think...
Well, you talk to enough people who knew him, who understand that question.
That's true. I think that, my father really... He was born in 1901. He didn't really build buildings of any note until he was over 50, And he really only had 20 years of tremendously productive working life, building life. But in that time, he did build some buildings that really changed the course of architecture. He restored kind of modernist architecture was obsessed with steel and glass and very light, wonderful, beautiful structures. But something about that wasn't right for him. It didn't fit with him. And he brought back, I think, a sense of classicism, a sense of weight, of buildings being really built with stones, with brick, with concrete. And I think in some ways he returned a kind of spirituality to architecture. And people say when they go in his buildings, they're spiritual experiences. They really are. The same way that an ancient ruin is spiritual. You go to the Parthenon, you go to the pyramids. These are, buildings from ancient times, that when you walk among those stones, you feel something. You feel something powerful, something ancient. There's something in the air. You feel those things in Lou's buildings. And it doesn't matter if you know architecture or you don't. You walk in the space, like the court at the Salk Institute in La Jolla. It's a sacred space, and yet it's a biological. It's a laboratory, right?
Yeah. But that is a place.
But it's a sacred space.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that is a place where the building and the site.
Sure. Oh, they come together phenomenally.
Marry each other like crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, as you walk up there, knowing that the Pacific is right over
That's
there.
Right. That's right.
And in between these two buildings. So you go in search of your father.
Yes.
Which every son wants to know.
Sure.
Every daughter wants to know. And what questions were you left with that you could not find an answer to?
At the end?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one of the fundamental questions that I had going in was my father really thinking about these choices he'd made in life, which led to the fact that he had several families and a rather complicated, confused personal life. And I suppose on some level I thought maybe he just didn't think about it that much. He was focused on his work, and that was it. I think what surprised me so much, really, through this journey, was how much he thought about everything he was doing, how much he thought about, each person in his life, and I think how many of those things caused him great difficulty and great pain. That was very surprising to me. I thought of him as somebody who just kind of really had a pretty one-track world. It was architecture all the way. And I discovered along the way that there were many, many other things that he was thinking about.
But how did he deal with it?
How did he deal with
the whole fact that he had, multiple families and he had children that he couldn't.
On some level, he didn't deal with it.
But you're saying he thought about it.
He thought about it.
What did he do? I mean,
well,
did he think about it? But what?
I think he sort of put it aside. This was a guy who.
That's what I think.
On some level, I think once again this idea that this is a man who, and I'm not apologizing for him. Don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to understand this man. At age 50-something, you finally feel like you're onto something. He felt he knew what he wanted to do.
Right.
He wanted to build ancient, he wanted to build modern buildings that had the feel and power of ancient ruins. That's it. He got it.
Right.
He had a eureka moment.
Right.
This is what I want to do with my life. That's an intoxicating, exciting thing, and that people came into his orbit, women came into his life, and he was just hell bent for living that life. And I sometimes I have this image of my father burning the furniture. Doesn't matter. Got to stay warm. Burn the furniture. Doesn't matter. I'm not taking any of this with me. I just got to, I have work I have to do. It's got to get done. I'm not going to live much longer. And I think there is this kind of sense in his life in the last 20 years of this race against time. And that I find enormously moving, heartbreaking, and also beautiful. This is a guy who was really here. And I sense that about him. He really used what he had. Could he have been a better dad? Well, perhaps. But, on some level I'm left with this feeling that what is. And what he did and what he managed to do in the few years that he was really fully doing it was remarkable. And as a son, there's an enormous sense of pride that comes from that, too.
Take a look at this. This is Robert Stern, who's now dean of the Yale School of Architecture. I'm not sure he was then, but was he then when you made this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, right here. Roll tape. Here it is.
Don't think that he was always trying to be a prince. He was very much trying to be a player. He wanted work. He wanted recognition. He wanted...
Doesn't every architect want...
I can't speak for every architect. No, I don't know. I think most architects who are... He was success-oriented.
I mean, of course they do. I mean, I
Sure.
I haven't met the architect yet.
No, of course not.
They didn't want the same things your
Of
father
course,
did. They
of
wanted the
course.
great work. They wanted a great idea. They wanted to be... They wanted to do... Most people want to do what it is they do.
Sure.
And do it better and better. I mean, that's
Sure.
what... The thing that happened to your father, it seems to me, from your film, later in life, he discovered the mission.
Yes. Yes.
And
that's true.
You get lucky if you discover the mission, have the opportunity earlier, but better at 50 than never.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. No, this little interview here with Robert Stern was kind of a revelation to me, because I think many people think of Louis Kahn as this absolute purist who's interested only in the pursuit of truth, beauty, at the expense of everything else. And here comes Robert Stern saying, well, no, he wanted to be a player. He just didn't know how, but that's what he wanted. And that was sort of a wonderful thing also for me as a son. It's sort of a turning point in the film, because I begin to see him also, he becomes more of a man here. He becomes less of a myth. I mean, as I began my life, he was a myth. He died when I was 11. He's a mythological figure.
He went from an idea to a man.
Absolutely. And that's really what the film is all about.
And that's good. Because you get your hands around a man, you can't get your hands around a myth.
That's right. And I think this is something we do so often to artists. We turn them into myths. We forget who they are, that they're flesh and blood. They have terrible struggles. They have complications. They have insecurities, all of these things. And it makes them alive. It makes them human. It makes them something that we can really understand. And obviously for me, it serves a dual purpose of not just understanding an artist from the inside out, but also understanding a father. And so I think that's kind of the dual story of the film. I mean, it very much is a son's journey, but discovering the inside life of an artist.
Was there any part of this bitterness on your part, anger on your part, sense of,
Well, it's a funny thing. In making the film, the producer and the editor and I struggled with this. I really don't feel anger towards him. It's not an emotion. It's an emotion I don't come to it easily about him. I just didn't feel it. And we'd get to certain points in the film and we'd say, Nathaniel, you got to get mad sometime. I mean, there's got to be something here. And of course,
you didn't have a
it does
normal
come
life.
out. Well, no, I just didn't experience those emotions when it comes to him. But I think you find in the film there's some moments when I call him on it. There's one letter that I write to him in the film. There's another time when I address him kind of directly in one of his buildings. It sounds melodramatic, but it works in the context of the film.
It does.
I mean, in a way, what happens in the film is it's establishing a dialogue with the guy. It's like bringing a ghost back. In the beginning of the film, he's kind of a ghostly figure who travels along the street and disappears in a doorway. And by the end, you feel he's here. He's in the context of this film, he's alive for a couple hours.
Roll tape. This is I.M. Pei, another great architect, talking about the lasting qualities, a subject we mentioned, of Kahn's architecture. Here it is. Anybody wouldn't talk to you?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. There are people out there who don't think necessarily that doing a project like this is maybe the right thing to do. Sure.
Like?
Well, there were some people in my father's world, some people who worked for him, that I think wanted to preserve the perfection of his memory.
Oh, really? Because I thought it might be. I thought it might have been the other thing. In other words, people who know the imperfections and don't want to tell them, and that's doing the same thing. I felt like I would be doing a disservice if I told him that your father was real and he had anger, emotion, ambition, whatever,
perhaps
rage, jealousy.
I mean, I think the thing that surprised me more than that was how many people would talk to me. I mean, it was wonderful to call up these guys who had known him very well, and how quickly they just said, "Yeah, come and talk to me," and how it opened them up to talk about this man who'd been their friend. Lou's been dead for 30 years, and it really shocks me how much this man affected other people. They cry about him still. They laugh about him still. He's still there for these people. He does have a
reverence that people just more than and maybe because I mean the buildings are so the Kimball. The Salk Institute. Why did he do it?
Do what? Have
these multiple families.
Oh gosh, I mean, I think it's probably more common in America than we think. In a lot of ways. Why did he do it? I mean, I think it's a complicated question. I think creative people often have very unconventional lives, and part of it is that the work is so exciting that other people are drawn into that, and there is a kind of romance in doing this kind of work. You know, you're involved in something at this level. It's exciting. You know, the two women who were involved in my father's life, who he was not married to, who are both in the film, my mother and the mother of my half-sister, Alex. Her name is Ann Ting. Both of these women, I talked to them in the film. You saw it. They're not angry at him. They still have questions about him. They still wonder what he really intended in certain parts of his life.
But is the answer he did it because he could?
I think it's more complicated than that. No, I don't think it's just because it could. I think it's too simple.
But I still don't know. I mean, it's first of all, it's complicated. It's complicated to do it. First of all, the logistics are complicated.
Sure, logistics are very complicated. Sure.
I mean, we discover people all the time who've led 2 lives or 3 lives.
Well, I mean, but this is the thing.
Having 2 families is not the norm.
No, it's not.
You know, having mistresses, and mistresses have children, but
right.
You know, the idea of having 2 families who live in a house and you visit is different than having a mistress who may or may not get pregnant.
Right. That's very true. That's very true.
And so you've got to, you ask yourself, what kind of mindset, is it simply because you can do it, because the nature of who you are and what you do, and
Well, I think it's certainly a man who's in the moment, right?
In the moment. And there's also this, I think, in terms of, is it some people, I don't know whether your father was this way or not, but some people are so interesting in that the way they treat people in their lives, and I mean that in a positive way, that the people accept the nature of it all.
Yeah,
because they love the person, they believe in the person, and they're saying, it's not a perfect world,
right?
But I'll take this compared to X, Y, Z.
Well, I think
any day of the week.
Sure. I mean, that's the interview that I have with my mother in the film, in which she says, "I paid a high price, but it was worth it."
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I think to some extent, the film also, there are women in it who speak for many women of a certain age who made very difficult choices in their lives because they wanted to be involved in work that they felt really mattered. I think both the women in my father's life, who he was not married to, paid a very high price, but they also did enormously important work.
And they said to themselves, this was a great man, and I was a part of a great man.
And he loved them.
I was in the same way that his buildings were part of his life.
Sure.
His work was part of his life.
Yeah.
His children was part of his life. I was part of his life. I was.
Oh, and they certainly were. And he loved them, and they loved him. There's no question, And I think, it's a complicated world that this film looks at.
What was the hardest thing about this?
The hardest thing about making the film?
Yeah.
Aside from finding the support to make it.
Yeah, well, that's
which is always part of it.
Yeah. What it cost you to make it?
Less than you'd think.
Okay. I'm just going to my business.
I think the hardest thing really was to have the courage to keep going, knowing that at the end of it, somehow, my father would look very different to me. Because you have this child's eye view, and you're afraid to open these boxes and boxes of things, and afraid to ask people questions, because on some level, you're going to find out about things about the man that you didn't know before, and it's going to change your memories, on some level. It changes your perception of him. And I was always afraid, somehow, that I'd come out at the end with a less, with something less than what I started with. And what really surprised me and was wonderful is I came out with a lot more.
You came out a lot more.
A lot more. A much fuller picture of the man. I mean, as we said, he went from being a myth to being a man.
But in the end, is this the story of a son's journey to find his father, period? Or is this the story of a great man?
Oh, it's both. It's both. It's also the story of an American family. It's a story of an artist's life. It's absolutely the story of a son looking for his father. It's also the story of the women in his life. I mean, it's sort of trying to get my arms around a whole life that
and
was
it's
his
of
life.
interest to us because he was a great man, because he was a great architect. That makes it of an interest to us.
Well,
in other
I mean,
words, would this have been as equally an interesting movie? It had nothing to do with a great man.
On some level, probably, because
that makes it your story rather than the story of the circumstances.
It's definitely the story of a son looking for his father. Yeah. Sure, that's the fundamental thread of it.
His father's a famous man.
Yeah,
who died in the bathroom at Penn Station.
Yes,
bankrupt.
Just about. Yeah, yeah. Pretty ironic death, wasn't it, for an architect?
Yeah.
An architect who tried all of his life.
How come?
Well, he was coming back from India. He was coming back from one of his trips. I mean, the guy drove himself to death. You know, there's no question. He absolutely, there was work he had to get done. He traveled alone to these faraway places. Crazy schedule. And he had certainly driven himself. You know, he was 73 years old, didn't take care of his health particularly. He was an ox. He was a tough guy. And he never admitted any kind of frailty. He knew he was sick. He knew he had heart trouble. But he never admitted that to any of us, to anyone. And he came back through Penn Station. And as you know from the film, we have somebody who actually saw him in the men's room at Penn Station when he died, which is an enormously dramatic scene in the film. Meeting this man who actually saw my father dying, you know. But he collapsed and died in Penn Station, New York. And it was unidentified for 3 days. Because his address on the passport had been crossed out, and they couldn't make a proper identification. And he lay in the city morgue for 3 days, unidentified. And I remember those days, I mean, you know, like they were yesterday, waiting at home, wondering if he'd tried to call us, you know, what had happened. And all three families, of course, wondering where this man was. And it was like he disappeared. And then suddenly he turned up, you know, they found his body in the morgue. And, I mean, immediately, of course, everybody said, what an ironic death. This is a man who tried his whole life to create places of great beauty, dies in the men's room at perhaps one of the, you know, least successful pieces of urban architecture in the history of the Western world. It was an ironic death, and, you know, but quite symbolic, too.
Roll tape. This is where, it's another conversation in the film. Take a look at this.
What a crazy world.
You hollow.
You said to me, amazing man.
Yeah, this guy. That's a boat my father designed, actually, for that man. And that was one of the few interviews in the whole film that I did not tell him who I was. I was able to get away with that. Usually people knew, you know, that I was coming. And as you said earlier, you never know if somebody's going to give you the real story. Well, this guy, because he didn't know who I was, you know, didn't really have any time for me as I wandered around the boat. And then I got the chance to tell him, look, I'm Lou's son. And that overflowing of emotion, you know, was just, was astonishing and beautiful. You know, this is a guy who's been dead for 30 years, and immediately it's all right there. And it's been wonderful to meet people like that along the way who knew my father and who could really tell me what he was like.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
My Architect is being seen currently at the Film Forum in New York and at the Ritz-5 Theater in Philadelphia. It is rolling out nationwide through spring 2004. If you want to know about date and time, take a look at myarchitectfilm.com for dates and locations. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.